There's going to be the restoration of the temple and priesthood. So the temple is not going to be built in the tribulation. The tabernacle and the temples were always built in a time of obedience, and they were destroyed in a time of wickedness. So that's the pattern. The temple's not going to be built by the bad guys. The temple's going to be, but it may be built with the help of the nations, and it may be just as the temples and tabernacles in the past had a Gentile hand in them. Bezalel was not an Israelite who built the tabernacle, helped build the furnishings for the tabernacle. Hiram, king of Tyre, his mother was Israelite, but his father was not. He was from Tyre. King Herod the Great, the Idumean, he was an Edomite. He was an Edomite convert. He beautified the temple in Yeshua's time. There's always been a Gentile hand in building the temples. And there may be some that are from a Masonic background, but they repent, they turn to the Lord. But they have the wisdom and the skills and the divine privilege to help build the temple. And once it's built, God will raise up Lazarus. Or perhaps He'll raise Lazarus just before then. The whole story of Lazarus and the raising of Lazarus is a story about the restoration of the Kohanim that are led by Eleazar, because Lazarus is a Greek form of the name Eleazar. And the only place in the New Testament where the name Ephraim is mentioned is in the story of Lazarus. And it says that after he raised Lazarus, he says in John 11:43, he says, and when he thus had spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out! And Lazarus comes out with his grave clothes and a napkin over his head. And later in verse 54, Jesus therefore walked no more openly amongst the Jews, but went thence unto a country near to the wilderness, into a city called Ephraim, and there continued with his disciples. Now, if you read the scriptures, you read about a time when we're going to be taken to the wilderness of the peoples. We'll be brought under the bond of the covenant. That's the lost tribes led by Ephraim. That's the house of Israel. And so this is a prophetic thing. Yes, it was something that literally happened to a man called Lazarus, but it's also a shadow picture of the future. God is going to raise the Levitical priests, the sons of Eleazar, or Lazarus in Greek, and they are going to bear witness to His name to the Jewish people. But he's like sending a servant to Judah, while He goes personally to His firstborn Ephraim, who is gathered in the wilderness. So this is a prophetic blueprint. And none of the other Gospels mention the raising of Lazarus, which is really peculiar, because it's the biggest miracle He did, apart from rising from the dead Himself. So the temple and priesthood will be in operation during this Messianic era that is before the tribulation. And the raising of Lazarus is a picture of the Kohanim being raised up at the same time that Ephraim is getting ready to return to the land. He's coming to the wilderness of the people. I've done another teaching on this where I go through it in a lot greater detail. Another thing that will occur before the tribulation is the Magog Invasion. In Ezekiel 38 verse 8, after many days thou shalt be visited. This is about Gog. Thou shalt be visited in the latter years. Thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword and is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel. Now that's the modern day area called the West Bank. That's Judea and Samaria, or the Shomron. And that's currently it's got a low population, and it's awaiting for its people. It's waiting us, and it's awaiting more Jewish immigration into Judea. So now it's always been waste, but is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely in them. Now we're told elsewhere that we're going to leave the north country and we're going to be brought to the mountains of Israel. Then Gog says, I'm going to come down to the mountains of Israel. So if we or our descendants get to the mountains of Israel from the north country, may get to watch Gog and all his minions come down. And for some reason they're riding horses. They're not, I don't see laser swords or Apache helicopters there. For some reason they're riding horses. So the world then is going to be somewhat different than it is today. So that'll be interesting to see how that works out, to say the least. So there's going to be a great deal of prophecies that will be filled between now and the tribulation. And I'm trying to show that there's, there's another thing I should have mentioned. One of the reasons why that Gog-Magog invasion has to occur before the tribulation is they're going to spend 7 years burying the bodies. And you can't do that when you're in the tribulation. You know, it's not business as usual. This invasion occurs just after we return from the North Country and we're back in the land, living happy little lives and playing happy families. And Gog is destroyed, and we have the leisure and time to bury the bodies. And a bit of blood and bone is good for the garden. Anyway, after that, we're going to be in a time of peace and prosperity. And if you read the end of the chapters concerning the restoration of the lost tribes in Jeremiah 23 from the North Country and Ezekiel 34, which seems to parallel Jeremiah 23 but doesn't mention the North Country, you find that the remnant of his flock is brought out of the North Country and they're brought to the mountains of Israel. So we're going back to the mountains of Israel, and then we're going to be blessed and in a time of prosperity. And it's not the millennial reign of Yeshua. It's this messianic era that we're going to enter into sometime in the future after we leave the North Country. So this is paradigm shifting stuff. I'm trying to break some paradigms. Yes, all that stuff in the tribulation is true, but it's not just yet. Later, the bride will fall asleep during this time of prosperity, and it will require the tribulation itself to cause her to wake up. But she'll be safe in the wilderness, if you recall. But the saints, the believers and the nations, they'll be executed by the Antichrist, by Satan, by the dragon when he comes down out of heaven in Revelation chapter 12. So let's check out the timeline for some sort of sequence of events and see if we can roughly slot things together.